The carriage wheel cracked against a hidden stone, and Eleanor Ashworth was thrown so hard against the door that her breath left her body in a single gasp. Outside, the horses screamed and reared, and the driver's shout was swallowed by a gust of wind so violent it rocked the entire carriage sideways. Margaret Whitfield, her aunt, grabbed for the strap above the window, her knuckles white, her face drained of color. "We are going to tip," Margaret said, not as a question, but as a fact she had already accepted. Eleanor pressed her hand flat against the frozen glass and looked out into a world that had turned white and merciless in the space of an hour. The sky, which had been a pale, indifferent gray when they left the last coaching inn, had thickened into something alive, something that hurled snow sideways instead of down, something that had swallowed the road whole. She could no longer see the hedgerows that had lined the path only 20 minutes before. She could no longer see anything except churning white and the black shapes of trees bending low under the weight of the storm. "Sit back, Aunt Margaret," Eleanor said, though her own voice trembled. "Please, if we brace ourselves, we will not be thrown." The carriage lurched again, and this time it did tip, one wheel lifting entirely off the ground, before crashing back down with a force that made Eleanor bite through her lip. She tasted copper. She did not care. All she could think, in that strange, narrow way the mind fixes on small things during large disasters, was that she had left home 3 days ago to marry a man she had never once met in person, and now she might die on a frozen road before she ever saw his face. The thought did not frighten her as much as it should have. That realization frightened her more than the storm did. Outside, the driver was shouting something about the horses, about the harness, about a shape in the snow ahead that might be a gatepost, or might be nothing at all. Eleanor forced the window down an inch, ignoring her aunt's cry of protest, and the cold hit her face like a slap, sharp and clean and strangely clarifying. "There," she said, pointing through the swirling white. "A light. Do you see it? There is a light." Margaret leaned across her, squinting into the storm, and after a long moment she nodded. A house. Thank heaven. A house. The driver had seen it too. He turned the horses, fighting the wind with his whole body, and the carriage groaned forward, through drifts that were already knee-deep and rising. Eleanor gripped the seat and prayed, not elegantly, not in the practiced phrases she had been taught in church, but in short, desperate bursts that amounted to please, and not yet, and not like this. The house grew larger as they approached, and Eleanor realized with a jolt that it was not merely a house. It was enormous, a great dark shape of stone and turret and blazing window, the kind of house that belonged to old families and older money, the kind of house that had a name people said with a certain reverence. She knew, before the driver even called it out, exactly whose house this was. Ravensmore Hall. She was 3 days early. She had left Hertfordshire with time to spare, believing she would arrive well before the wedding, well before she needed to face anyone at all, beyond her own reflection in the looking-glass, practicing the calm, pleasant expression of a woman content with her fate. She had planned to arrive quietly, to settle into whatever chamber was prepared for her, to wait for Julian Hartley, with the patience of a woman who had agreed to marry a stranger because her father's debts demanded it. She had not planned on a storm strong enough to nearly kill her. She had not planned on arriving like this, soaked and trembling and half-frozen, at the door of a man she had never met and did not wish to meet, the Duke of Ravensmore, cousin to her intended husband, a man whose reputation in London drawing rooms was spoken of only in careful, lowered voices. The carriage came to a stop before a set of stone steps, so steep and slick with ice that Eleanor could not imagine climbing them without breaking her neck. The door of the house opened before the driver had even climbed down, spilling warm golden light out into the churning dark, and a tall figure appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy coat, his face unreadable in the shadow cast by the storm. "Get them inside," the man called out, his voice carrying easily over the wind, deep and commanding, in a way that made the driver move twice as fast. "Now, before the drift reaches the steps." Eleanor did not wait for someone to open the carriage door for her. She pushed it open herself, ignoring her aunt's protest, and the wind nearly tore it from her grip. She stumbled down into snow that swallowed her to the knee, her skirts instantly soaked through, her breath torn from her lungs by the cold. A hand caught her elbow before she could fall, strong and sure, and she looked up into a face she recognized instantly from the single portrait Julian had sent her months ago, a face that shared his bloodline but none of his softness. The Duke's eyes were dark, almost black in the strange half-light of the storm, and they moved over her face with an intensity that made her suddenly, absurdly aware of how disheveled she must look. Hair torn loose from its pins, cheeks raw with cold, lips trembling. "You are not who I expected to find in this storm," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite welcome, and not quite suspicion, but sat uncomfortably between the two. "Eleanor Ashworth," she managed, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. "I am to marry your cousin." Something shifted behind his eyes, quick and sharp, gone before she could name it. "Then you have arrived at a very poor time to test fate, Miss Ashworth," he said, and without waiting for her response, he turned and half-carried, half-guided her up the icy steps toward the light and warmth of the open door, shouting orders behind him, for his aunt to be brought in as well, for the horses to be stabled, for the fires in the east wing to be built high, before the ladies froze where they stood. Eleanor barely had time to register the grandeur of the entrance hall before her legs gave out beneath her, the cold and the fear and the sheer exhaustion of the journey finally claiming their price. She felt herself falling, felt strong arms catch her before she struck the stone floor, and the last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the Duke's face above hers, no longer unreadable, but sharp, with something that looked, for just one unguarded moment, like fear. When she woke, she was lying beneath a mountain of blankets in a chamber she did not recognize, a fire roaring in the grate, and her aunt dozing in a chair beside the bed, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Eleanor lay still for a long moment, listening to the wind howl against the windows, feeling the ache in her limbs, remembering the crash of the carriage and the light in the storm, and the face of the man who had carried her inside. The Duke of Ravensmore. Not Julian, not the man she was meant to marry. His cousin. A man whose name was spoken with caution in every parlor she had ever sat in. A man rumored to be cold since the death of his wife 3 winters past. A man she had been warned, gently, but firmly, not to provoke. And she had arrived on his doorstep 3 days early, carried into his house half frozen and unconscious, with her betrothed nowhere in sight, and a storm outside that showed no sign of breaking. Eleanor closed her eyes again, and beneath the exhaustion and the relief of simply being alive, she felt something else stir, something she refused to name, something that had everything to do with the strange, fierce look on the Duke's face in the moment before she fainted. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself it was only the shock of the storm, the strangeness of waking in an unfamiliar house, the natural unease of a woman thrown into the path of a man she had been told to fear. She told herself many things that night, lying awake and listening to the storm rage on outside, and she believed almost none of them. Downstairs, in a study lined with books he rarely had time to read, Alexander Ravensmore stood before his own fire, with a glass of brandy he had not touched, staring into the flames, and trying, without success, to push the image of Eleanor Ashworth's face from his mind. He had known, of course, that his cousin's bride was expected to arrive before the wedding. He had not expected her to arrive like this, flung upon his mercy by a storm that had already claimed 2 lives on the northern road that very evening, according to the messenger who had struggled through the drifts an hour before her carriage appeared. He had not expected to feel his chest tighten the way it had when he saw her stumble in the snow. He had not expected the strange, unwelcome lurch of protectiveness that had driven him down those icy steps before he had even fully decided to move. She was his cousin's bride. That fact sat in his mind like a stone, immovable, undeniable, and yet the moment he had looked into her eyes in the swirling white of the storm, something in him had recognized her, had known her, in a way that made no sense and troubled him more than he cared to admit. He drank the brandy in one swallow, and told himself it was nothing more than the strange energy of the storm, the adrenaline of a crisis handled, the natural concern any man would feel for a woman nearly lost to the cold. He told himself many things that night as well. Outside, the snow kept falling, and the road to Ravensmore Hall disappeared entirely beneath it, sealing the house and everyone inside it away from the rest of the world. For how long, no one yet knew. Morning came, though it was difficult to call it morning at all, since the sky remained the same bruised gray it had been the night before, and the snow had not once stopped falling. Eleanor woke to the sound of her aunt moving quietly about the chamber, drawing back heavy curtains to reveal a window nearly buried in white, the glass rattling faintly with each gust of wind. "How long have I slept?" Eleanor asked, her voice still rough from the cold she had taken the night before. "Through the whole night, and half the morning," Margaret said, turning from the window with visible relief on her face. "You gave me a fright, child. The housekeeper says you were lucky. Another quarter hour in that storm, and things might have gone very differently." Eleanor sat up slowly, testing her limbs, grateful to find them merely stiff rather than truly injured. "And Julian? Has any word come from him?" Margaret's expression flickered, the smallest hesitation before she answered. "None. The roads are impassable in every direction, according to the staff here. No messenger could get through, even if one were sent. We are entirely cut off from the rest of the county, it seems, for as long as this storm continues." The words settled over Eleanor with an odd weight. She had expected to arrive quietly, unremarked, and wait for her betrothed in the comfort of anonymity. Instead, she found herself trapped inside the home of a man she barely knew, with the man she was meant to marry nowhere to be found and no way of knowing when he might arrive. A soft knock came at the door, and a young maid entered with a tray of tea and bread, her cheeks pink from the cold corridors, her curtsy quick and nervous. "His Grace asks that you join him for breakfast when you are able, miss, in the small dining room. He says there is no hurry, only that you are welcome whenever you feel well enough." Eleanor thanked the girl and, once she had gone, turned to her aunt, with a look that asked a question she did not quite know how to voice. "Well," Margaret said, folding her hands primly in her lap, "it would be rude to refuse the hospitality of the man who carried you in from a storm, and likely saved your life in doing so. We are his guests, Eleanor. However unplanned the circumstance, we shall go down, and we shall be gracious, and we shall wait for this weather to break like sensible people." Eleanor dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep blue wool that she had packed for cold weather travel, and allowed her aunt to arrange her hair into something respectable, though her hands trembled slightly as she worked, a fact Eleanor chose not to comment on. When she finally descended the wide staircase of Ravensmoor Hall, she had a moment to truly see the house in daylight, and it took her breath away nearly as thoroughly as the storm had the night before. Portraits lined the walls in heavy gilt frames, generations of Ravensmoor faces staring down with the same dark eyes she had seen in the Duke himself. The staircase curved in a wide, graceful arc, its banister carved with intricate patterns that must have taken some long-dead craftsman years to complete. Everywhere she looked, there was evidence of old wealth, old history, the kind of grandeur that came not from spending, but from simply existing for centuries. She found the small dining room by following the sound of a low voice giving instructions to a servant, and when she entered, the Duke of Ravensmoor rose from his seat at the head of the table, with a formality that seemed almost out of place, given the circumstances of their meeting the night before. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "I am relieved to see you looking recovered." "Thanks to you, Your Grace," she said, taking the seat a footman pulled out for her. "I understand I owe you my life, or at the very least, my fingers and toes." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough to it, that Eleanor felt an odd satisfaction at having produced it. "I would hardly claim credit for the weather's failure to kill you. That distinction belongs entirely to your own stubbornness in refusing to freeze." "Is that meant as a compliment, Your Grace?" "Take it as you like," he said, and this time, the almost smile became something closer to real. "I find stubbornness a useful quality in a person, whatever form it takes." Margaret entered a moment later, full of apologies for her lateness, and the conversation shifted to safer ground. The storm, the state of the roads, the likelihood of Julian's arrival being delayed by days rather than hours. Eleanor found herself watching the Duke throughout the meal, noting the careful way he spoke, weighing each word before he offered it, as though he had learned long ago that carelessness came at a cost he was no longer willing to pay. It was nothing like the coldness she had been warned to expect. It was something quieter, more guarded, a wariness that reminded her, unexpectedly, of herself. "Forgive my bluntness," the Duke said as the meal drew to its close, "but I confess, I did not expect my cousin's bride to be quite so young." "I am 21, Your Grace," Eleanor said, lifting her chin slightly. "Old enough to know my own mind, whatever assumptions might be made otherwise." "I meant no insult," he said. and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it. A softening she had not expected from a man of his reputation. Only that Julian's letters painted a picture of a woman eager for the match. I find myself curious whether that picture was accurate. The question caught her off guard, direct in a way she had not anticipated, and she found herself unable to summon the polite, practiced answer she had given a dozen times before to a dozen curious relations. Instead, she looked at him steadily and said, "My father arranged the match to settle a debt, Your Grace. I have exchanged perhaps a dozen letters with your cousin, and met him not once in person. I go into this marriage with my eyes open, and I intend to make the best of it, whatever my private feelings may be." She expected disapproval, or perhaps pity, the two reactions she had grown accustomed to whenever she spoke honestly about her circumstances. Instead, the Duke regarded her for a long moment, with an expression she could not quite read, something that looked almost like respect. "Then we have more in common than I expected, Miss Ashworth," he said quietly. "My own marriage, 3 years past, was arranged with rather less honesty than yours, and considerably more disappointment on both sides, before it ended in grief rather than resolution." It was the first time he had spoken of his late wife, and Eleanor sensed immediately that it was not something he did often, or lightly. She said nothing, only inclined her head in a way she hoped conveyed understanding rather than pity, and the moment passed between them like something fragile, carefully set down before it could break. The rest of the day settled into a strange, suspended quiet, the household moving through its routines, while the storm continued unabated outside, burying the roads deeper with every passing hour. Eleanor spent the afternoon in the library, a room so vast and well-stocked that she nearly forgot her circumstances entirely, losing herself in the shelves until the light through the windows began to fade into evening gray. She was standing on a small step stool, reaching for a volume on the highest shelf, when the stool wobbled beneath her, and she felt herself begin to fall. A hand caught her waist before she could hit the floor, steadying her with an ease that suggested considerable strength, and she found herself looking up into the dark eyes of the Duke, close enough now that she could see the small scar above his left eyebrow, close enough to smell the faint scent of cedar and smoke that seemed to cling to him. "You make a habit of nearly falling in my house, Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice was lower than it had been at breakfast, quieter, as though the words were meant only for her. "I make a habit of reaching for things beyond my grasp," she said, and immediately regretted the words, aware of how they might be taken, aware of how close he still stood, his hand still resting at her waist, as though he had forgotten to release her. He stepped back then, quickly, clearing his throat, and the moment shattered into something more ordinary, more proper, though Eleanor's heart continued to pound long after he had retrieved the book she had been reaching for, and placed it into her hands with a formal little bow. "Dinner will be served at 7, he said, already turning toward the door. "I trust you slept well enough to join us this evening." "I look forward to it, Your Grace," she said, and watched him go, and told herself, as she had the night before, that the strange warmth spreading through her chest meant nothing at all. She was becoming rather poor at believing her own reassurances. By the third day, the household at Ravensmoor Hall had settled into a rhythm that felt, to Eleanor's private astonishment, almost comfortable. The storm had not weakened. If anything, it had grown fiercer overnight, piling drifts against the windows so high that some of the lower rooms had gone entirely dark, lit only by candles, and the glow of the fires the staff kept burning without pause. No word had come from Julian, no messenger had managed the roads, and the household existed as though suspended entirely outside of ordinary time. Eleanor descended for breakfast to find the Duke already seated, a letter open before him that he folded quickly away when she entered, though not quite quickly enough to hide the tightness around his eyes. "Bad news, Your Grace?" she asked, taking her seat. "An old matter," he said, and something in his tone told her not to press further. "Nothing that concerns you, Miss Ashworth. I trust you slept well." "Well enough, given the circumstances," she said, "though I confess, I am beginning to feel rather like a permanent fixture of your household. 3 days is a long time to impose upon a man's hospitality." "You have imposed upon nothing," he said, and there was an edge of something almost fierce in his voice, quickly smoothed over. "The storm imposes. You are merely caught within it. As am I, as is everyone else in this county foolish enough to have built a house north of the river." "Margaret," who had joined them a moment later, launched into a cheerful account of a conversation she'd had with the housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Dunmore, who had apparently worked at Ravensmore Hall since before the Duke was born, and had opinions on every subject imaginable. The Duke listened with visible amusement, offering the occasional dry comment that made Margaret laugh outright, and Eleanor found herself watching him with a growing sense of confusion. This was not the cold, distant man she had been warned about in every drawing-room conversation she had overheard in the weeks before her journey. This was a man who listened carefully, who asked thoughtful questions, who seemed genuinely curious about the people around him, despite whatever grief had hardened him in the years since his wife's passing. After breakfast, restless from days of confinement, Eleanor asked whether there might be some part of the house she had not yet seen, some way to occupy the long, empty hours that stretched ahead of her. The Duke considered this for a moment before offering, somewhat unexpectedly, to show her the portrait gallery himself, a suggestion that seemed to surprise even him as he made it. They walked the long corridor together, Margaret trailing a discreet distance behind with her needlework, and the Duke pointed out ancestors going back nearly 2 centuries, sharing small stories about each one. A great-uncle who had gambled away half the estate before winning it back at cards, a grandmother who had scandalized the county by riding astride instead of side saddle, a great-grandfather whose portrait had been painted 3 times because he kept insisting the artist had made his nose too large. Eleanor laughed more in that half hour than she had in months, and she noticed, with some surprise, that the Duke seemed to be enjoying himself as much as she was, his usual guardedness slipping away bit by bit with each story he told. They stopped before a portrait near the end of the gallery, and Eleanor felt the mood shift instantly, the Duke's easy manner vanishing as though a door had closed somewhere behind his eyes. The painting showed a young woman with fair hair and a gentle, uncertain smile, her hands folded in her lap in the formal pose of a wedding portrait. "Your wife," Eleanor said quietly. It was not a question. "Caroline," he said, and her name seemed to cost him something to speak aloud. "We married when I was 23, she a year younger. It was arranged, much as your own marriage has been arranged, and I confess, I gave little thought to whether we suited each other before the papers were signed." "What happened?" Eleanor asked, then immediately regretted the question, aware of how forward it was, how little right she had to ask something so personal of a man she had known for only 3 days. He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the portrait, and Eleanor thought perhaps he would not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone low and careful, the voice of a man handling something fragile. "She was unwell for a long time before the end, a weakness of the lungs that no physician could cure, though several tried and took a great deal of money for their trouble. I was away often in those years, tending to business in London, telling myself the estate required my attention more than my wife did. I was wrong, and I did not understand how wrong until it was too late to correct it." "You could not have known she would fall so ill," Eleanor said gently. "No," he agreed, "but I could have chosen to be present regardless. I could have chosen her over the ledgers and the meetings, and the endless small business of running an estate that would have run itself well enough without my constant supervision. I did not choose that, and she died largely alone, with only servants for company in her final months, and I have carried that particular failure every day since." Eleanor found herself reaching out, without quite deciding to do so, and resting her hand lightly on his arm. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face, and something passed between them in that look, something neither of them had a name for yet, something that made the air in the gallery feel suddenly too warm, despite the cold pressing against every window in the house. "Grief is not the same as guilt, Your Grace," she said softly. "Whatever mistakes you made, you did not cause her illness, and you cannot undo the past by punishing yourself in the present." "That is a very generous reading of my failures, Miss Ashworth." "Perhaps," she said, "or perhaps I simply recognize the pattern, having spent a good deal of my own life believing that if I had only done things differently, my family's fortunes might never have collapsed, my father might never have needed to arrange this marriage, and I might have had the freedom to choose my own path, rather than having it chosen for me." He studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, a kind of recognition that mirrored what she had felt herself only days before. "You carry your own burden of guilt then." "We all carry something, Your Grace." "Alexander," he said suddenly. "My name is Alexander. I find I would rather hear you use it than continue with these endless formalities, given the circumstances that have thrown us together. Alexander, she repeated, testing the shape of it, and felt something warm bloom in her chest at the small, quiet intimacy of it. Then you must call me Eleanor. Eleanor, he said, and the way he said it, slow and deliberate, made her pulse quicken, in a way she knew, with growing unease, had nothing to do with the cold of the gallery around them. They stood there a moment longer, neither quite willing to break whatever fragile thread had spun itself between them, until the sound of Margaret's footsteps approaching reminded them both of where they stood, and who they were, and the man to whom Eleanor was promised, still absent, still delayed, still somewhere beyond the storm that had thrown his cousin and his bride together, in a manner neither of them had chosen, nor could easily undo. We should return to the fire, Alexander said, stepping back with the same abruptness he had shown in the library the day before. Mrs. Dunmore will have my head if I let you catch a chill wandering these drafty halls. Of course, Eleanor said, and let him lead her back toward the warmth, aware the entire way of the careful distance he now kept between them. Aware, too, of how much she wished, against every sense of propriety and duty, that he had not stepped back at all. That night, lying awake long after Margaret had fallen asleep in the chair beside her bed, Eleanor stared at the ceiling and tried to reason her way out of the feeling that had taken root in her chest, the unmistakable, unwelcome warmth that bloomed every time she thought of Alexander's voice saying her name. She told herself it was gratitude, nothing more, the natural fondness one might feel for a man who had saved her life and sheltered her from a storm. She told herself this many times, and by morning, she still did not believe it. The fourth day brought no change in the weather, but it brought a change in the household that Eleanor felt the moment she woke, a strange charge in the air that she could not immediately name. She dressed quickly, aware of an unusual quiet in the halls, the absence of the ordinary bustle of servants going about their morning tasks, and when she reached the top of the staircase, she found Mrs. Dunmore waiting for her, wringing her apron between her hands with obvious distress. Miss Ashworth, the housekeeper said, His Grace asked that I fetch you the moment you woke. There has been news, and I fear it is not the good kind. Eleanor's stomach dropped, and she followed the housekeeper down the stairs, at a pace that bordered on undignified, her mind racing through every terrible possibility. A messenger lost in the snow, an accident on the road. Word finally arrived that something had happened to Julian before he could ever reach Ravensmore Hall at all. She found Alexander in his study, standing before the fire with a letter, crumpled in one hand, his shoulders rigid with a tension she had not seen in him before, not even in the moments after her carriage had nearly overturned in the storm. "What has happened?" she asked, closing the door behind her, without quite thinking about the impropriety of doing so. A messenger managed the road from the south this morning, half frozen and barely able to speak, Alexander said, his voice tightly controlled. Julian is safe, delayed at an inn 2 days' ride from here, unable to continue until the weather breaks. That much is good news, and I would not have you alarmed on his account. Then what troubles you so deeply, Your Grace? He turned to face her fully then, and she saw in his expression something she had not expected, a kind of raw frustration mixed with something that looked, unmistakably, like fear. The messenger also carried word from London. My late wife's brother has begun making inquiries into the estate, questioning certain decisions I made in the years following Caroline's death, decisions regarding her dowry, and the settlements that were meant to pass to her family upon certain conditions. Is there any truth to his accusations? None, Alexander said, and there was steel in his voice now. The steel of a man who had spent years being doubted for grief. He wore too quietly to satisfy those who wanted a more visible performance of mourning. But truth has rarely stopped a man determined to see wrongdoing where none exists, particularly when there is money involved, and particularly when the accused has a reputation already tarnished by whispers he has never bothered to correct. Eleanor crossed the room without quite deciding to do so, drawn by an instinct she did not examine too closely, and stood before him with a directness that surprised them both. Then we shall correct them now, together, if you will permit me to help. I may be new to your household, and newer still to your circumstances, but I am not without some skill in managing difficult correspondence. My father's affairs required a great deal of careful letter writing in the years before his debts became public, and I learned a thing or two about presenting facts in their clearest, most persuasive form. Something shifted in Alexander's expression, surprise giving way slowly to something warmer. Something that looked almost like gratitude, mixed with a wonder he seemed unable to fully hide. You would help me with this, knowing it has nothing to do with you, knowing you have every reason to keep your distance from a matter that could easily become a public scandal. I would help because you helped me first, when you had every reason to leave a stranger's carriage to its fate in that storm, Eleanor said, and because I do not much care for the idea of you carrying this burden alone, when there is something I might do to lighten it. They spent the remainder of the morning bent over his desk together, drafting a careful response to Caroline's brother, Eleanor suggesting phrases here, softening a harsh line there, Alexander dictating the particulars of the settlements while she wrote them out in her clear, careful hand. It was, in its own strange way, one of the most intimate mornings of Eleanor's life, not because of any touch or any stolen glance, but because of the simple, steady closeness of working alongside someone toward a shared purpose, of feeling useful in a way she had rarely been allowed to feel useful before. By midday, the letter was finished, sealed, and set aside to be sent the moment the roads allowed, and Alexander sat back in his chair with the first genuine ease Eleanor had seen in him all morning. "Thank you," he said simply. "I do not know that I have thanked anyone so sincerely in a very long time." "You are welcome, Alexander," she said, and the use of his name, now familiar between them, felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I find myself curious," he said after a moment, studying her with an expression she could not quite read, "whether Julian knows the sort of woman he is fortunate enough to be marrying." The question landed with an unexpected weight, and Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain whether it came from pleasure at the compliment or discomfort at the reminder of exactly who she was promised to marry, and who stood before her now. "Julian knows me only through letters, as I told you before," she said carefully. "I cannot say what sort of woman he imagines me to be, only what sort of woman I have tried to present myself as in our correspondence." "And what sort is that?" "Agreeable," Eleanor said, with a small, wry smile. "Accommodating. The sort of woman who does not complain about arrangements made without her consultation, who understands her duty and performs it without unnecessary drama." "That sounds rather exhausting to maintain," Alexander said, and there was something gentle in his tone that made the words feel less like a challenge and more like an invitation to honesty. "It is," Eleanor admitted, surprising herself with the confession. "I have found, these past 4 days, that it is a good deal easier to simply be myself, without the performance. I do not know that I have felt so at ease in any company, for a very long time, Your Grace." The room fell quiet after that, the fire crackling softly in the grate, the storm still howling faintly beyond the thick stone walls, and Eleanor became suddenly, acutely aware of how close they sat, of the way Alexander's eyes had settled on her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, and her breath catch somewhere in her throat. "Eleanor," he said quietly, and something in the way he said her name told her he was about to say something neither of them could easily take back. Before he could continue, the door opened without warning, and Margaret bustled in with her usual cheerful energy, entirely unaware of the moment she had interrupted, chattering about a game of cards she hoped to arrange for the evening to help pass the long hours of confinement. Alexander straightened immediately, the careful distance returning to his posture, and Eleanor felt the moment slip away, half relief and half loss tangled together in her chest. "A splendid idea," Alexander said, his voice returning to its usual measured calm. "I shall have the servants prepare the drawing room." He left shortly after, some matter of estate business calling him away, and Eleanor remained at the desk a moment longer, staring down at the letter they had written together, running her fingers absently over the edge of the paper, and wondering, with a growing unease she could no longer easily dismiss, exactly what he had been about to say before the interruption, and exactly what she would have said in return. That evening, over cards in the drawing room, Alexander was careful, almost too careful, to keep the conversation light and general, directing his attention as often to Margaret as to Eleanor, and Eleanor understood, with a pang of something that felt uncomfortably like disappointment, that he was building a wall between them, brick by careful brick, the same way she found herself doing whenever her thoughts strayed too far in his direction. It did not work as well as either of them hoped. Every time their eyes met across the card table, something passed between them that no amount of careful distance could entirely erase. And Eleanor went to bed that night with the unsettling certainty that whatever was growing between them had already gone too far to be easily undone. Storm or no storm, cousin or no cousin, however many walls either of them tried to build. By the 5th day, the snow had begun to slow, thin flurries replacing the driving sheets that had battered the county for so long, though the roads remained buried under drifts too deep for any carriage to attempt. The household, having settled fully into its strange, suspended rhythm, found small ways to occupy the hours, and Eleanor discovered that Ravensmoor Hall possessed an old conservatory at its eastern edge, glass-paned and filled with plants, that had somehow survived the bitter cold through the careful attention of a gardener named Thomas Vale, who tended them with a devotion that bordered on reverence. She had gone there seeking quiet, a place to think through the tangle of feelings she could no longer pretend did not exist, and found instead that Alexander had the same idea, standing among the frost ferns with his hands clasped behind his back, staring out through the glass at the white world beyond. "I did not mean to intrude," Eleanor said, already turning to leave. "You are not intruding," he said, without turning around. "I find I have grown rather used to your company these past days, Eleanor. It would feel strange now to send you away." She stepped further into the conservatory, drawn by the warmth of the space and the strange, fragile beauty of green things surviving against a backdrop of endless white. "It is a lovely room," she said, running her fingers over the leaves of a plant she did not recognize. "I did not expect to find anything so alive in the middle of such a storm." "Caroline planted many of these herself," Alexander said quietly. "It was one of the few things that seemed to bring her genuine joy in the years before her illness took hold. I have kept it exactly as she left it, though I confess, I do not come here often. It feels, some days, like walking into a memory I am not certain I am ready to face. And today? Today I found I wanted to be somewhere that reminded me of gentleness," he said, and turned to look at her then, his dark eyes soft in a way she had not seen before. "I did not expect that reminder to arrive in the shape of my cousin's bride, appearing in the doorway at precisely the moment I needed the company." Eleanor felt her breath catch, the words landing somewhere deep in her chest, and she took a step closer without quite deciding to do so, drawn by an instinct stronger than any sense of propriety she had been raised to maintain. "Alexander," she said softly, "I think we both know that whatever this is between us has grown into something neither of us intended, nor can easily explain away as gratitude or circumstance." "I have tried to convince myself otherwise," he admitted, his voice rough with an honesty that seemed to cost him something to speak aloud. "I have told myself a dozen times these past days that what I feel is nothing more than the natural warmth one feels toward a woman who has shown kindness during a difficult season. I have failed, each time, to believe my own reasoning." "As have I," Eleanor said, and the confession, once spoken, seemed to loosen something tight and anxious in her chest, replacing it with a fragile, frightening kind of relief. "I am promised to your cousin, Alexander. I have known him only through letters, and yet I am bound to him by every rule of honor and duty I have ever been taught to respect." "I know it," Alexander said. "I have thought of little else these past 2 nights, lying awake and trying to reason my way toward some version of honor that does not require me to pretend I feel nothing for you. I have not yet found it." They stood close together now, close enough that Eleanor could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the chill still seeping through the glass panes around them, close enough that she could see the small flecks of gray at his temples, the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of grief, carried too long and too privately. Neither of them moved to close the remaining distance between them, though the pull to do so felt, to Eleanor, almost unbearable. "What are we to do?" she asked quietly. "I do not know," Alexander admitted. "I know only that I cannot in good conscience stand by and watch my cousin marry a woman whose heart, I suspect, no longer belongs entirely to him, if indeed it ever did. And yet, I know equally well that I have no right to claim that heart for myself, not while he remains bound to you by an agreement made in good faith, whatever the circumstances of its making." "Then we must be careful," Eleanor said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them, aware of how little care either of them had managed to exercise these past 5 days. "We must remember who we are, and what is owed, And to whom? We must, Alexander agreed, though his eyes held hers with an intensity that suggested he believed the words no more than she did. A sound from the corridor beyond broke the moment, footsteps approaching, and both of them stepped back with the practiced speed of people accustomed to hiding what they felt, so that by the time Mrs. Dunmore appeared in the doorway to announce that luncheon was ready, Eleanor and Alexander stood a respectable distance apart, discussing the merits of a particular fern, with the studied casualness of two people who had spent the entire morning discussing nothing more dangerous than plants. Luncheon passed in ordinary conversation, Margaret full of news about a card game she had won handily the evening before, the staff bustling about with their usual quiet efficiency, and Eleanor found herself watching Alexander across the table, noting the careful way he avoided her eyes now, the tension in his shoulders that had not been there before their conversation in the conservatory. It was during the long, quiet afternoon that followed, while Margaret napped by the fire and the household settled into its customary hush, that Eleanor found herself once more in the library, seeking the comfort of books to distract her from thoughts that had grown increasingly difficult to manage. She had barely settled into a chair with a volume of poetry when Alexander appeared in the doorway, his expression troubled in a way that made her set the book aside immediately. "There is something I must tell you," he said, closing the door behind him with a care that suggested he did not wish to be overheard. "I received another letter this morning, delivered by the same messenger who brought word of Julian's delay. It seems my cousin has written directly to me, rather than to you, with news he asked me to convey." Eleanor's stomach tightened with a dread she could not quite name. "What news?" "He writes that the inn where he is delayed has become rather more comfortable than he expected, and that he has found the company there surprisingly agreeable," Alexander said, choosing his words with obvious care. "He does not say so outright, but I have known Julian since we were boys, Eleanor, and I recognize the particular tone he uses when he speaks of a woman who has caught his interest. I believe my cousin may be finding reasons to delay his journey that have little to do with the state of the roads." The revelation landed strangely, not with the heartbreak Eleanor might have expected to feel upon learning her betrothed's attention had wandered, but with something closer to relief, a loosening of a knot she had not fully realized she carried. "Do you think he no longer wishes to marry me?" she asked. "I think," Alexander said carefully, "that my cousin entered this engagement for reasons as practical and as loveless as your own, and that he may be discovering, much as you have discovered here at Ravensmoor Hall, that duty and desire do not always point in the same direction." Eleanor absorbed this in silence for a long moment, turning the words over in her mind, feeling the fragile shape of a possibility she had not allowed herself to consider until now. "If that is true," she said slowly, "then perhaps neither of us is as bound as we believed ourselves to be." "Perhaps not," Alexander said, and something in his voice, some careful thread of hope he seemed almost afraid to fully release, told her he had been thinking the very same thing. They said little else on the matter that day, both of them aware that nothing could be settled while Julian remained absent and his true intentions unconfirmed, but something had shifted between them nonetheless, a small crack of possibility opening in a wall that had, until that morning, seemed entirely solid. Eleanor went to bed that night with her heart considerably lighter than it had been in days, though she was careful, even in the privacy of her own thoughts, not to build too much hope upon a letter whose true meaning remained, for now, only a guess. The sixth day brought the first true break in the weather, a pale, hesitant sun pushing through the clouds by mid-morning, though the drifts remained far too deep for any carriage to attempt the road. Eleanor woke with a strange lightness in her chest that she attributed, at first, to the improving weather, until she remembered the conversation with Alexander the day before and understood the true source of her unexpected hope. She found him in the stables after breakfast, having gone in search of fresh air after days confined indoors, and discovered him examining one of the horses with the quiet, focused attention of a man who found comfort in useful work. He looked up when she entered, and the smile that crossed his face, unguarded and genuine, made her chest tighten with a warmth she no longer bothered trying to deny. "You have found me at my least dignified," he said, gesturing at his coat, dusted with hay and mud from the stable floor. "I confess I find more peace among the horses some days than among the portraits of my ancestors." "I do not think dignity was ever the point of a stable, Your Grace," Eleanor said, unable to keep the teasing note from her voice. "Alexander," he corrected gently, We agreed, I believe, to dispense with such formalities between us. Alexander, then, she said, and stepped closer to the horse he had been examining, a great gray creature that regarded her with mild curiosity. Is he unwell? A small strain in his leg, nothing serious, though I like to check on him myself rather than leave the matter entirely to the grooms. He was Caroline's favorite in the years before her illness. I have kept him long past his usefulness for riding, out of sentiment more than sense. There is nothing wrong with sentiment, Eleanor said softly. I think perhaps you have spent too many years believing there was. Alexander studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, and then, without quite seeming to decide to do so, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face that had come loose in the stable's draft. His fingers lingered a moment longer than the gesture required, and Eleanor felt her breath catch entirely, the space between them suddenly charged with something neither of them could pretend to misunderstand. Eleanor, he said, her name rough in his throat, I have tried, these past 2 days, to convince myself that what I feel for you is nothing more than the natural fondness of a man grateful for unexpected kindness. I find I can no longer sustain the pretense, nor can I, she whispered, and the words, once spoken aloud, felt like a door thrown open, after years of being kept carefully shut. He closed the small distance between them slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, to remind them both of duty and propriety, and the promise she had made to his cousin, and when she did not step back, when instead she tilted her face up toward his, with a longing she no longer had the strength to hide, he lowered his head and pressed his lips to hers with a gentleness that seemed to carry within it every unspoken feeling of the past 6 days. The horse shifted in its stall beside them, snorting softly, and the sound broke the moment just enough for reality to come flooding back in, sharp and cold as the winter beyond the stable walls. Eleanor stepped back first, her hand pressed to her lips, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. We cannot, she said, though her voice shook with the effort of saying it. Alexander, whatever this is, whatever we feel, I am still promised to your cousin, and until that promise is formally released, we have no right to act upon what has grown between us. I know it, Alexander said, his own voice unsteady, his eyes dark with a regret that seemed aimed as much at himself as at the circumstances that bound them. I should not have done that. I am sorry, Eleanor. I allowed myself a liberty I had no right to take. I do not think either of us can claim to have been entirely without fault in the matter, Eleanor said, some of her composure returning, even as her heart continued to race. I did not step away when I should have. I wanted the very thing you offered, Alexander, and that wanting frightens me more than any storm has these past 6 days. They stood in silence for a long moment, the horse shifting restlessly beside them, the pale winter sun slanting through the stable's high windows, and Eleanor felt the full weight of their situation settle over her like a physical thing, heavy and inescapable. She was bound to Julian by a promise made in good faith, however loveless, and Alexander was bound by ties of family and honor that made any pursuit of her feel, to him, like a betrayal too great to easily forgive himself for committing. We must wait for Julian to arrive, Alexander said finally, his voice regaining some measure of its usual careful control. Whatever his letter suggested about his own wandering attentions, nothing can be settled honestly until he stands before us and speaks his true intentions. Until then, Eleanor, I think it best that we exercise considerably more caution than we have managed thus far. I agree, Eleanor said, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth, every part of her rebelling against the sensible course, even as she recognized its necessity. They returned to the house separately, Alexander lingering behind to finish his examination of the horse, Eleanor walking back alone through the crisp, clearing air, her thoughts a tangled mess of longing and guilt, and a hope she still did not quite trust herself to fully believe in. She found Margaret in the drawing room, embroidering by the window, and forced herself into a semblance of normal conversation, though her aunt, sharp-eyed as ever despite her cheerful disposition, seemed to notice something amiss almost immediately. You look flushed, my dear, Margaret said, setting down her needlework. Have you caught a chill again? Only from the cold outside, Eleanor said, avoiding her aunt's knowing gaze. The stables are drafty this time of year. Margaret said nothing further on the matter, though the look she gave Eleanor suggested she suspected considerably more than the weather was responsible for her niece's high color and distracted manner. Eleanor spent the remainder of the day in a state of restless distraction, unable to settle to any task for long, her thoughts circling endlessly back to the moment in the stable, to the press of Alexander's lips against hers, to the impossible tangle of duty and desire that seemed to have no clean resolution, regardless of which direction she turned. That evening, over a quiet dinner, Alexander was careful and formal in a way that felt, to Eleanor, like a wound freshly bandaged, the surface calm concealing something raw and unresolved beneath. They spoke of practical matters, the state of the roads, the likelihood of the weather continuing to improve, the possibility that Julian might finally be able to complete his journey within the week, and beneath every careful, ordinary word, Eleanor felt the current of what had passed between them that morning, undimmed and unresolved, waiting for whatever came next. She went to bed that night, with her heart torn cleanly in two directions, duty pulling one way, longing pulling the other, and no clear path yet visible between them. Outside, the snow had finally stopped falling entirely, and through her window, for the first time in 6 days, she could see stars scattered across a clearing sky, cold and distant, and utterly indifferent to the storm of feeling that had taken root within the walls of Ravensmore Hall. The 7th day arrived bright and merciless in its clarity, the sun reflecting off endless fields of snow with a brilliance that made the eyes ache, and word came early that the road from the south, while still difficult, had become passable enough for a determined rider to attempt it. Eleanor received this news with a strange mixture of relief and dread, understanding that it meant Julian's arrival could no longer be far off, and understanding too that whatever fragile, unspoken understanding had grown between herself and Alexander would soon be tested against the reality of the man she had actually promised to marry. She spent the morning walking the gardens with Alexander, both of them wrapped heavily against the cold, their breath fogging in the crisp air, the silence between them companionable rather than strained, though both were aware of the unspoken tension that had not fully dissipated since the moment in the stable. The garden, buried under snow, held a stark beauty that Eleanor found she preferred to the riotous color of summer, every hedge and statue softened into gentle white shapes, the world reduced to its simplest, cleanest form. "I have been thinking," Alexander said, breaking the comfortable quiet as they paused beside a frozen fountain, "about what I ought to do when Julian arrives." "And what have you decided?" Eleanor asked, though her heart had begun to race at the mere mention of the topic. "I have decided that honesty, however difficult, is the only path I can walk without losing whatever regard I still hold for myself," Alexander said, his eyes fixed on the frozen water rather than on her face. "I intend to speak with Julian directly, man to man, and tell him what has grown between us these past days, before any further deception can take root. He deserves that honesty, whatever pain it may cause him, and you deserve a future, decided with full knowledge, rather than continued pretense." Eleanor felt a rush of something that was equal parts fear and relief, the prospect of honesty both terrifying and, in its own way, liberating. "And if he insists upon proceeding with the marriage regardless, having been told the truth, then I will honor his claim," Alexander said, though the words seemed to cost him a great deal to speak. "Whatever I feel for you, Eleanor, I will not become the sort of man who steals his cousin's bride out from under him through deceit or manipulation. If Julian wishes to marry you still, knowing everything, I will step aside and wish you both every happiness, however much it may break something in me to do so. And if he does not wish to proceed, then I will ask you, when the time is right, whether you might consider a future with me instead," Alexander said, finally turning to look at her, his dark eyes steady, despite the vulnerability plain in his expression. "Though I recognize that such a question, asked too soon or in the wrong manner, could easily seem like precisely the manipulation I have just sworn to avoid." Eleanor reached out and took his gloved hand in hers, an act so small and yet so significant, given everything that stood between them. "Whatever happens when Julian arrives, Alexander, I want you to know that these 7 days have changed something in me that I do not think can easily be undone. I came to Ravensmore Hall prepared to marry out of duty, expecting little beyond a life of quiet accommodation. I did not expect to find, in the middle of a storm, a man who made me believe that something more might be possible. Nor did I expect to find, in the depths of a grief I had carried for 3 years, a reason to hope for something beyond simple survival. Alexander said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer seemed inclined to hide. Whatever comes next, Eleanor, I do not regret a single moment of these past 7 days, storm and all. They returned to the house as the afternoon light began to fade, both of them quieter than usual, both aware that the fragile suspension of their circumstances was drawing rapidly to a close. Eleanor spent the remainder of the day in a state of restless anticipation, unable to settle to any task, her mind circling endlessly around the conversation in the garden and the uncertain future it promised. It was near evening, as the household gathered for what had become their customary quiet dinner, that the sound of horses and raised voices reached them from the front of the house, carrying clearly through the cold, still air. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat, and she saw the same recognition flash across Alexander's face, the unmistakable understanding that their strange, suspended idyll had finally come to its end. A footman appeared in the doorway of the dining room, slightly breathless from having run the length of the house. Lord Hartley has arrived, Your Grace. He begs everyone's pardon for the delay and asks to be shown in immediately. Eleanor rose from her seat with hands that trembled slightly despite her best efforts at composure, and beside her, she saw Alexander do the same, his jaw set with the particular firmness of a man preparing himself for a conversation he knew would be difficult, but had already resolved to have with complete honesty. Margaret, sensing the sudden tension in the room, looked between the two of them with an expression that suggested she had finally understood, with perfect clarity, exactly what had transpired during their week of enforced confinement. Well, Margaret said quietly, folding her napkin with deliberate care, it seems our long wait has come to its end. Eleanor smoothed her skirts with hands that refused to stop trembling, and together with Alexander, walked toward the entrance hall to greet the man she had traveled so far to marry, uncertain, for the first time in her carefully ordered life, of exactly what the next hour would bring, or what she truly hoped it would bring, or whether the answer to that question had already been decided somewhere deep within her during the long, snowbound days that had just come to their close. Julian Hartley stood in the entrance hall of Ravensmore Hall, stamping snow from his boots and laughing at some comment made by the footman helping him with his coat, entirely unaware of the tension that had gathered in the household to receive him. He was, Eleanor noted with a strange detachment, precisely as his portrait had suggested, fair-haired and pleasant-featured, with an easy, open smile that seemed to come naturally to him, the kind of face that invited trust without demanding it. "Miss Ashworth," he said warmly, crossing the hall to take her hand and press a light kiss to her knuckles. "I cannot begin to express how deeply I regret the delay that kept us apart these past days. I trust my cousin has treated you with every courtesy in my absence." "He has been the very soul of hospitality, Lord Hartley," Eleanor said, aware of Alexander standing a short distance away, his expression carefully neutral, though she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders that only she, after 7 days of close observation, had learned to recognize. "Alexander," Julian said, turning to his cousin with genuine affection, clasping his hand warmly, "you look well, though rather more serious than I remember. I hope my bride has not been too great a burden upon your patience these past days." "No burden at all," Alexander said, his voice carefully controlled. "Miss Ashworth has proven herself remarkably resilient in the face of considerable difficulty. The storm nearly claimed her carriage the night she arrived." Julian's easy smile faltered slightly, genuine concern crossing his features. "Good heavens, I had no idea the journey proved so dangerous. I am deeply sorry, Miss Ashworth, that circumstances kept me from being here to see to your safety myself." "There is nothing to forgive, Lord Hartley," Eleanor said, and found, to her own surprise, that she meant it entirely, understanding now that if Julian had arrived on time, if the storm had never trapped her at Ravensmore Hall, she would never have discovered the truth of her own heart, however complicated and inconvenient that truth had proven to be. The evening that followed passed in a blur of polite conversation, Julian full of stories about his delayed journey, the comfortable inn where he had been forced to wait out the worst of the storm, and Eleanor found herself watching him carefully throughout, searching for some sign of the wandering attention Alexander had described, some evidence that Julian's feelings had shifted as thoroughly as her own. She did not have long to wait for confirmation. As the evening wore on, and Margaret excused herself to retire early, exhausted from the excitement of Julian's arrival, Eleanor found herself alone, with her betrothed in the drawing room, the fire casting long shadows across his pleasant, open face. "Miss Ashworth," Julian said, his usual easy manner giving way to something more hesitant, more careful. "I find I must confess something to you, though I hardly know how to begin without seeming the worst sort of scoundrel." "Please, Lord Hartley," Eleanor said gently. "Whatever you must say, I think perhaps I already suspect its shape." Julian looked at her with visible surprise, then something like relief. "Then perhaps you will forgive me more easily than I deserve. During my delay at the inn, I made the acquaintance of a young woman, a Miss Charlotte Bryant, traveling with her family toward her own relations in the north. We were thrown together by circumstance, much as I understand you and my cousin have been thrown together here, and I confess that in the course of our enforced companionship, I discovered feelings I had not expected to find, feelings considerably stronger than any I have managed to summon in our months of correspondence." Eleanor felt a rush of relief, so profound it nearly brought tears to her eyes, though she was careful to keep her expression composed. "Lord Hartley, I think perhaps we have both discovered something similar these past days, each in our own separate circumstance." "You as well?" Julian asked, his eyebrows rising with evident surprise, though the surprise quickly gave way to something like understanding, as he glanced toward the door through which Alexander had departed some minutes before. "I did not intend for it to happen," Eleanor said quietly. "The storm threw us together in ways neither of us anticipated, and over the course of this past week, I have come to know your cousin in a manner I never had the opportunity to know you, through your letters alone. I do not say this to cause you pain, Lord Hartley, only to be as honest with you as you have just been with me." Julian was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an expression that held no anger, only a kind of thoughtful relief. "Then it seems we find ourselves in rather fortunate circumstances, Miss Ashworth, however unconventional the path that led us here. I entered this engagement out of duty to my family and yours, believing myself capable of building a contented life, regardless of whether love came into the matter. I find now that I would rather build that life with a woman who has genuinely captured my heart, and I would rather see you settled with a man who has done the same for you, than see either of us bound to an arrangement neither of us truly wants." "You are not angry?" Eleanor asked, hardly daring to believe the ease with which this conversation had unfolded. "I confess I am relieved more than anything," Julian said, a genuine smile breaking across his face for the first time since he had begun his confession. "I have spent the entire journey here, dreading the conversation I believed I would need to have with you, torn between duty and the feelings Miss Bryant had awakened in me. To learn that you share a similar tangle of feeling lifts a weight from my chest I did not fully realize I was carrying." They talked a while longer, working out the practical matters of how such a delicate situation might be handled, how the engagement might be dissolved without undue scandal touching either family, and by the time Eleanor finally retired for the night, she felt lighter than she had in months, the impossible tangle of the past week resolving itself into something that felt, against all reasonable expectation, like genuine hope. She found Alexander waiting near the top of the staircase, clearly having lingered in hopes of learning how the conversation with his cousin had unfolded. His expression carefully neutral, but his eyes betraying an anxiety he could not fully hide. "Julian has released me from our engagement," Eleanor said softly, unable to keep the small, disbelieving smile from her lips. "He has found his own affection elsewhere, during his delay upon the road, and he wishes us both every happiness in whatever path we choose to walk next." Alexander's carefully composed expression broke apart entirely, relief and joy flooding across his features, in a way that made Eleanor's heart ache with tenderness. "Then there is nothing standing between us any longer, save whatever fears we have not yet found the courage to speak aloud." "I find I have very few fears remaining, Alexander," Eleanor said, closing the distance between them without hesitation this time. "Only hope, and a growing certainty that this storm, however dangerous it seemed upon that first terrible night, may have been the greatest fortune of my entire life." He reached for her hand, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, with a gentleness that carried within it every unspoken promise of the days and weeks ahead, and together, they stood at the top of the staircase of Ravensmoor Hall, two people who had entered a storm as strangers bound to others, and emerged from it, against every reasonable expectation, bound instead to each other. News of the broken engagement and the unexpected new understanding between Eleanor and Alexander could not, of course, remain private for long, and within days of Julian's departure to seek out Miss Charlotte Bryant and press his own suit with considerably more enthusiasm than he had ever shown toward his arranged marriage, word had begun to travel through the county in the particular manner such things always did, carried by servants and tradesmen, and the endless network of correspondence between families who considered themselves entitled to know one another's business. Eleanor remained at Ravensmore Hall with her aunt, the road still too treacherous for a return journey to Hertfordshire, and found herself facing a different sort of challenge now that the storm had passed, and the practical business of the household had resumed its ordinary rhythm. Letters began to arrive, some from relations expressing shock at the broken engagement, others from more distant acquaintances, eager to hear the particulars of a scandal they had only heard second-hand, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time since her arrival, having to defend the choices she had made during those 7 snowbound days. "Your father will need to be told directly," Margaret said one afternoon, setting aside a letter from Eleanor's own household with a troubled expression. "He arranged this match to settle a considerable debt, Eleanor. He will not take kindly to learning it has been broken, whatever the circumstances." "I know it," Eleanor said, though her resolve did not waver, despite the very real concern her aunt's words raised. "I have already begun a letter explaining everything, Aunt Margaret. I intend to be entirely honest with him, as I have been with everyone else involved in this matter, and I intend to offer whatever assistance I can toward settling the debt through other means, should he require it. And if he insists you honor the original arrangement regardless of Julian's own change of heart?" Eleanor considered this question carefully before answering, aware that it touched upon fears she had not yet fully allowed herself to examine. "Then I will have a difficult conversation ahead of me, Aunt Margaret, but I do not believe my father, whatever his faults, would insist upon a marriage that neither party any longer wishes to pursue, particularly when an equally advantageous alternative has presented itself in its place." It was this alternative that occupied the household's attention over the following days, as Alexander, with a directness that surprised even Eleanor, took it upon himself to write to Eleanor's father personally, laying out the full and honest account of everything that had transpired at Ravensmore Hall, from the dangerous circumstances of her arrival to the gradual, unexpected affection that had grown between them during their enforced confinement. He proposed, in clear and generous terms, to settle whatever debt had originally prompted the arrangement with Julian, and to offer Eleanor's hand a proper, formal engagement of his own, conducted with all the honor and propriety her family might wish. The response, when it finally arrived after a week of anxious waiting, brought both relief and a small measure of amusement, as Eleanor's father, a practical man above all else, expressed considerably more enthusiasm for a match with a duke than he had ever managed for the original arrangement with a mere lord's heir, and gave his blessing with an eagerness that made Eleanor laugh aloud, despite the underlying seriousness of the matter. "It seems," Eleanor said, reading the letter aloud to Alexander in the study where they had spent so many hours together during the storm, "that my father finds a duke considerably more appealing than a future baron, whatever the circumstances of the arrangement. I confess I am relieved to hear it, though I would have pursued you regardless of your father's opinion on the matter," Alexander said, taking the letter from her hands and setting it aside so he could take both her hands in his instead. "I have spent 3 years believing myself incapable of feeling what I feel for you now, Eleanor. I do not intend to let anyone's disapproval, real or imagined, stand between us any longer." With her father's blessing secured, the practical matters of a formal engagement began in earnest, Alexander insisting upon a proper courtship despite the unconventional circumstances of their meeting, wanting Eleanor to have the experience of being properly wooed, rather than simply claimed as the fortunate result of a storm and a broken arrangement. He took her riding through the slowly thawing countryside once the roads became passable, showed her every corner of the estate she would one day help him manage, introduced her formally to the tenants and staff who would become her responsibility as Duchess, and in every gesture, every careful attention, Eleanor felt herself falling more deeply in love with a man she had, only weeks before, expected never to meet at all. Word of their engagement spread through society, with considerably more excitement than the original broken match had generated concern. The romantic story of a storm-bound courtship capturing the imagination of everyone who heard it. And Eleanor found herself, somewhat to her own bemusement, becoming something of a minor celebrity in the drawing rooms of the county. Her tale of near disaster turned unexpected fortune repeated and embellished with each retelling. She cared little for the gossip itself, but she found genuine satisfaction in knowing that Julian, too, had found his own happiness. His correspondence with Miss Charlotte Bryant blossoming quickly into a formal courtship of its own. The two of them apparently as well suited to one another as Eleanor and Alexander had proven to be. Their own arranged engagement having freed them both, in the end, to find genuine affection rather than mere obligation. "It is a strange thing," Eleanor said one evening, walking through the portrait gallery with Alexander, pausing before Caroline's portrait as she often did now, no longer with any sense of intrusion, but with a quiet respect for the woman who had once called this house her own. To think that if the storm had never come, if Julian had arrived on schedule as planned, none of this would have happened at all. I would have married a man I barely knew, and you would have remained here alone with your grief, and we might never have discovered what we might mean to each other. "I have thought of that many times these past weeks," Alexander said, his eyes moving to Caroline's portrait as well, though his expression held none of the old guilt that had once shadowed his face whenever he looked upon it. "I do not believe in fate as some grand, inevitable force, Eleanor, but I confess I have begun to believe that some things happen precisely as they must, however painful or frightening the path that leads us there." "Do you think Caroline would have minded?" Eleanor asked softly, aware of how delicate the question was, how much care it required. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, studying the portrait with an expression of genuine tenderness rather than lingering pain. "I think Caroline, of all people, would have wanted me to find happiness again, rather than spend the remainder of my life punishing myself for a grief I could not have prevented. I carried guilt for 3 years, believing I had failed her by not being present enough in her final months. I do not think she would wish that same guilt to keep me from a future with you, Eleanor. If anything, I believe she would be glad to see this house filled with warmth again, rather than the cold silence I allowed to settle over it after her passing." Eleanor reached for his hand, and together they stood before the portrait a moment longer, honoring the woman who had once lived within these walls, before turning away and continuing their walk through the gallery, toward whatever future awaited them beyond its long, quiet corridor of ancestors and old griefs, and new, unexpected beginnings. Spring arrived at Ravensmoor Hall with a gentleness that felt, to Eleanor, like a direct answer to the violence of the storm that had first brought her there, the snow melting away in slow, steady stages to reveal gardens that had lain hidden and dormant through the long winter months. The frozen fountain, where she and Alexander had once stood discussing honesty and duty, now ran freely again, its water catching the pale spring sunlight in a way that seemed almost deliberately symbolic of everything that had thawed between them since that terrible, wonderful first night. The wedding was set for the first week of May, a date chosen carefully to allow the roads time to fully recover from winter's damage, and to give both families ample opportunity to prepare for a celebration that promised to be considerably grander than either Eleanor or Alexander had originally anticipated, for what had begun as a quiet arrangement of convenience. Eleanor's father, delighted beyond measure at the prospect of his daughter becoming a duchess, had spared no expense in the preparations, a fact that amused Eleanor greatly, given how differently he had approached the original, more modest arrangement with Julian. Julian himself arrived a week before the ceremony, Miss Charlotte Bryant on his arm, the two of them radiantly happy in a way that put to rest any lingering concern Eleanor might have harbored about the pain their broken engagement had caused him. Charlotte proved to be a warm, quick-witted young woman who took an immediate liking to Eleanor, the two of them falling into easy friendship within hours of their first proper introduction, laughing together over the strange circumstances that had brought all four of them to this unexpected, happy conclusion. "I must confess," Charlotte said one afternoon, as she and Eleanor walked together through the now blooming gardens, that when Julian first told me the story of his broken engagement, I feared I would find myself resented by the woman he had left behind. I am deeply relieved to find instead that we might become genuine friends. I could hardly resent the woman who helped free me for a happiness I did not know I was capable of finding," Eleanor said warmly. "If anything, Miss Bryant, I owe you a debt of gratitude nearly as great as the one I owe that terrible storm." "Then let us agree to be grateful together," Charlotte said, laughing, "for storms and inns, and all the strange, Inconvenient circumstances that seemed to have a habit of leading people exactly where they were always meant to go. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the kind of soft spring day that seemed to promise nothing but good fortune ahead, and Eleanor stood before the mirror in her chamber, the same chamber where she had first woken after the storm nearly claimed her life, and marveled at how thoroughly her circumstances had transformed in the space of a single season. Margaret fussed over her gown with tearful pride, adjusting a fold here, a ribbon there, until she finally declared her niece the most beautiful bride she had ever had the privilege of dressing. "Your mother would be proud of you today," Margaret said softly, pressing a kiss to Eleanor's cheek. "Not for the title you are about to claim, but for the courage you showed in choosing honesty over convenience, when convenience would have been so very much easier to simply accept." "I could not have found that courage without your support, Aunt Margaret," Eleanor said, embracing her aunt carefully, so as not to disturb either of their carefully arranged gowns. "You have been a steady presence through every strange turn of this journey, and I am more grateful than I can properly express." The ceremony itself took place in the small stone chapel on the Ravensmoor estate, its ancient walls decorated with early spring flowers gathered from the very gardens Eleanor had walked through so often during her long, snowbound confinement. Alexander waited for her at the altar, dressed in formal dark clothing that suited him far better, Eleanor thought, than the heavy winter coats she had first seen him wearing. His dark eyes bright with an emotion he no longer bothered to hide, the careful guardedness that had once defined him entirely dissolved into open, unmistakable joy. As she walked down the short aisle toward him, her hand resting lightly on her father's arm, Eleanor found her mind drifting back to that first terrible night, the carriage tipping in the storm, the fear that had gripped her as the horses screamed and the wind tore at the world outside, and the sight of a light in the distance that had turned out to be so much more than mere shelter from the cold. She thought of the portrait gallery, and the conservatory, and the stable where their first kiss had changed everything between them, and she felt a wave of gratitude so profound it nearly brought tears to her eyes before she had even reached the altar. "You look as though you are thinking of something rather serious for a wedding day," Alexander murmured as she took her place beside him, his eyes warm with amusement and affection in equal measure. "I am thinking," Eleanor whispered back, "that I very nearly did not survive to see this day at all, and that the same storm which so frightened me that first night has given me everything I could possibly want in this life." "Then we are agreed," Alexander said softly, taking her hand as the ceremony began, "that it was, despite every moment of fear it caused us both, the most fortunate storm either of us has ever weathered." The ceremony proceeded with quiet dignity, the vows spoken clearly and sincerely, by two people who had found their way to each other through circumstances neither could have predicted nor planned. And when Alexander finally kissed his new duchess before the small gathered assembly of family and friends, the chapel bells began to ring out across the estate, carrying the news of the marriage across fields and hedgerows, still damp with the last of winter's melting snow. The wedding breakfast that followed filled Ravensmoor Hall with a warmth and laughter it had not known in years, Julian raising a toast to his cousin and his former betrothed with genuine affection, Charlotte laughing beside him, Margaret dabbing happily at her eyes throughout the entire celebration, and Eleanor's father beaming with the particular pride of a man who had, through nothing more than fortunate circumstance, secured a considerably grander future for his daughter than he had ever dared to hope. As evening fell and the celebrations finally began to wind down, Eleanor found herself standing once more before Caroline's portrait in the long gallery, Alexander's arm around her waist, both of them quiet in the gentle hush that follows any great celebration. "I promised myself, that first night I found you in the storm, that I would keep the fire in the east wing, burning through every difficulty that followed," Alexander said softly. "I did not know then how thoroughly that promise would come to mean something far greater than simple hospitality." "I think," Eleanor said, leaning into him, "that some fires, once lit, have a way of burning far longer and far brighter than anyone could have predicted, whatever storm first brought the spark that started them." Outside the tall windows of Ravensmoor Hall, the last light of the spring evening faded slowly into the soft dark of a clear night sky. No storm gathering on the horizon this time, only the quiet, steady promise of a future neither Eleanor nor Alexander could have imagined, when a broken carriage wheel first threw them together on a road buried deep in snow, and changed, in the space of a single terrible and wonderful night, the entire course of both their lives forever after.